Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here, and also a proud member. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. He's chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. He's director of the New York State Psychiatric Institute, psychiatrist-in-chief at New York Presbyterian Hospital at Columbia University Medical Center. He's also, perhaps most importantly, a native son of Cleveland, Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman. Each year, approximately 42.5 million American adults, that's roughly 18.2% of the total adult population in the United States, suffer from some form of mental illness. Despite increased awareness of mental illness, bipolar disorder, depression, schizophrenia, and many others, the public and the medical profession still struggle to understand what causes these conditions and how they can be treated effectively. In some ways, it seems, the brain is still a bit of a black box. Dr. Lieberman's new book chronicles the history of mental illness and the medical profession's efforts to treat it. The book is called Shrinks, The Untold Story of Psychiatry. He chronicles the development of what he himself calls the most distrusted, feared, and denigrated of all medical specialties, quote, the stepchild of medicine, in its transformation to become a respected medical profession that treats millions of people each year. Dr. Lieberman has been a practicing psychiatrist for nearly 40 years. Much of his research is focused on the early detection and treatment of schizophrenia. He was the principal investigator of the largest, longest, and most comprehensive independent study ever funded by the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health to examine existing therapies for schizophrenia. In addition to Shrinks, Dr. Lieberman has authored more than 500 papers and articles published in the scientific literature and has written or edited 10 books on mental illness and psychiatry. He's a member of numerous scientific organizations. In 2000, he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine, and in 2005, to fellowship in the American Association for the Advance of Science. Dr. Lieberman is the immediate past president of the American Psychiatric Association as well. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a pleasure to be here at a club that has such an illustrious and distinguished tradition, and I think my name is going to follow all the really extraordinary and prominent people is really a privilege. It's also a great opportunity to be able to come back to Cleveland, which is my hometown, to be able to see friends and family, and particularly pleased that some of my colleagues are here also who appear to be gluttons for punishment. Fred Fries, who's been somebody who's been a heroic and important figure in the field of mental health care for so many years. And we've shared many, many opportunities to work and be together. And the Case Western Reserve group that's out here, and Molly Malloy, McAvoy, who served with me just most recently as on the board of trustees at the American Psychiatric Association, and Mark Munitz, a colleague who's chair of psychiatry at a local hospital and who I've worked with for many years also. And to reconnect with old friends who I haven't seen for a while, like Milton Tamar Maltz, who have been so important in so many ways to our society and to the city of Cleveland. So I'm kind of an unlikely speaker, even though I am a native son, because of the fact that, as Dan said, I've been in psychiatry now for almost 40 years, but most of it was spent kind of toiling in the trenches of research, doing research on the neurobiology and psychopharmacology of psychotic illnesses, and publishing in scientific journals, writing in this kind of turgid prose in this formulaic fashion that characterizes that medium, and editing books for the doctors, but never for the public. But along the way, and more recently, particularly after I took the chair at Columbia, which is the largest and one of the leading hospitals or departments of psychiatry in the country, and having to deal with all of the policy and financial issues that a modern academic department has to deal with, and I suppose that's why Bob Ronas isn't here today. He's trying to figure out how he's going to make budget. And going to Washington and lobbying for legislation about healthcare financing and biomedical research. And then getting elected president of the APA and having to be a spokesperson and out there in the public arena trying to defend the profession and advocate for mental illness, which has been a historical, egregious healthcare disparity, I guess I became radicalized, and in a quixotic moment thought that I would do something, like write a book. And this is the result of it. It's a lot harder than I thought. I thought I could dash it off like in 6 months, but it took actually over 2 years, and it's a lot harder to write something that you want people to really be interested in and engaged in so that they can't put it down. And you'll be the judge of whether that was successful or not. But it's also interesting because of the fact that it's in psychiatry and how I ended up being in psychiatry. And it's kind of, I guess, a comment on how either unaware or committed to this field that I actually went into it, because I went to medical school in the early 1970s, and in 1973, when this picture was taken, psychiatry was under siege. In fact, there was a meeting of the Board of Trustees of the American Psychiatric Association, in which the president said these words, quote, "Psychiatry is facing the brink of extinction." And that was because there was really a fulminating movement which questioned the legitimacy, the need for psychiatry. And as a medical student who was rotating through different clinical rotations, apparently I was oblivious to this because I got captivated by the just clinical and academic interest of this discipline. But outside in society, and it wasn't because of the 60s and the counterculture, the field was being roiled by so much controversy. And although I'd like to think that at the time this was really a misguided kind of a vendetta against a specialty of medicine, the reality is that it wasn't entirely misguided. In fact, like so many civil causes that have been pursued by constituencies in the population historically, like protests against the Vietnam War, the Voting Rights Act, women's suffrage, the Supreme Court decision on abortion. There are many things that advocacy has done that have resulted in good change. And could this have been one of them? And as I said, there was an actual basis for it. For most of the period during which psychiatry has existed, the 19th and 20th century, the main way in which mental illness was treated was in asylums. Basically, self-contained communities out in rural areas that were ostensibly to maintain people who couldn't live within society in humane, structured, supported conditions, but actually turned into snake pits. Also, psychiatry's ability to formulate a scientific understanding of the brain and how it related and caused mental illness was, for the first century and a half of its existence, was pretty much unsuccessful. We had, as one example of this, Wilhelm Reich, who was a respected psychiatrist who treated many prominent, famous people in his clinic, who developed orgone therapy, where you went into this orgone box and the obstructions to the flow of your orgone energy were removed so that you could have a healthy, complete, and as frequently as you could manage it, orgasm. That was the basis of his theory. So he took Freud's libidinal theory one step further. And then there was, unfortunately, the more ominous development of the prefrontal lobotomy, which was developed by a Portuguese neurologist, Moniz, that won him a Nobel Prize, but then was adapted by an American neurologist, Walter Freeman, who said the lobotomies can only be performed in operating rooms by neurosurgeons, and that's not efficient enough. We need to be able to develop them to be performed in doctors' offices. So he developed what became known as the ice pick lobotomy, where you could use an instrument like an ice pick and insert it and drive it through the sphenoid sinus, through the orbit of the eye. And by the time he retired, he performed over 2,500 lobotomies. And then on the sort of more psychosocial side of things, Freudian theory really was dominant in world, but particularly American psychiatry for over half a century, and somewhat hubristically made claims for things that it had absolutely no basis for. But at the time, it was spinning a pretty good yarn that had a lot of people believing, as reflected by this cover of Time magazine, which had the most famous psychiatrist of that day, Walter Menninger, on the cover, showing how psychiatry could unlock the keys to the brain. And by that, they were suggesting that it wasn't just, figuring out all of the aspects of your neurotic idiosyncrasies or the symptoms of more severe mental illnesses like psychosis or bipolar disorder, manic depressive illness, and autism, but also could save humanity from scourges like war and poverty and racism. So it was vastly overpromising and underperforming. And this all sort of crystallized into a synthesis of what really became the anti-psychiatry movement, which was formed in the 1960s by these two people. So on your right is Thomas Szasz, who actually was a psychiatrist, a self-hating psychiatrist, who wrote a book called The Myth of Mental Illness, where he disputed that there was any such thing as mental illness, that people who were mentally ill were simply exercising their freedom to act in a way that was different than the conventions of our society. And we were penalizing them by putting a diagnostic label on them. And his collaborator was none other than L. Ron Hubbard, who has founded Scientology, or founded the philosophy of Dianetics, and was seeking to utilize this to address the psychological ills of people. So these two teamed up and formed the anti-psychiatry movement. Now, it was interesting for two reasons, that these strange bedfellows would collaborate on this, but also because it became the first time in history, and still the case, that you have a medical specialty that is an anti-movement. You've never heard of an anti-dermatology movement, or an anti-orthopedics movement, or an anti-rheumatology movement. But there's an anti-psychiatry movement that was founded in the 60s, and it still exists and is very active today. Now, all this really kind of came together and then became kind of inflamed by one other event that occurred in the early 70s while I was in medical school, deciding to go into psychiatry, and that was in the form of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a movie that was made based on Ken Kesey's book written in the late 60s about the counterculture, which, if you've read the book or even saw the movie, you'll realize this was really a political polemic in which he was railing against the establishment authority, not a diatribe against psychiatry. But that was the way it was construed. And here's a little film clip. We'll see if this works.
You take a cigarette break, boys, easy.
That's Jack Nicholson, who plays an antisocial individual who's hospitalized.
Seated. Ah.
Would you sit up, please?
Sure. Love to.
Oh, boy.
There might be a little fluid in them boots, you know what I mean, boys? Still a little leak. Light shine, boys, and send the specimen to Nurse Ratchet. You know what I mean?
So Nurse Ratchet is the dominant authority on the immunity zone, which he
All
has
right,
challenged in leading
Out
the
with your gum.
patients to rebel against her. and they're treating his rebellious behavior with, in this case, electroshock therapy.
Conductant.
A little dabble, do you? Right, Mr. Jackson?
Open your mouth.
What's that?
This will keep you from biting your tongue.
Well,
Now just bite down on it.
oh,
That's right. Just bite down.
huh?
Now bite down on it.
Good. Oh. Are you ready? Here we go.
So he's having a seizure after having received what's called unmodified ECT. That's electroconvulsive therapy without anesthesia to sort of limit the contractions and the tonic-clonic movements that are part of the seizure, which is now standard procedure. And ultimately, because the ECT doesn't really subordinate him to the authority of the doctor and nurses on the unit, they subject him to having a lobotomy, which turns him into basically a vegetable. And so, you know, you have the metaphor of psychiatry being used as an instrument of political purposes, you know, for this purpose. And this kind of portrayed things in the worst possible way to the public and still exists. I mean, when you look at it, you know, ECT seems pretty gruesome. I mean, to think about it, it's pretty gruesome, passing electricity through the brain to induce a seizure. That's pretty bad. Well, the problem is this, twofold. ECT is a highly effective and highly safe treatment, which for people that are desperately ill and can't wait or are unresponsive medication is a lifesaver. And many people whose lives have been saved and continue to be productive because of ECT, you know and have seen on television, or maybe even have voted for, because they've done so without publicly acknowledging it. The other thing is that it does look gruesome, and the idea is gruesome. But you know what? Surgery is pretty gruesome. Does anybody watch surgery? I mean, if you go into surgery, you see someone cutting into the abdomen of somebody and taking out their organs and intestines and so forth. But nobody resists surgery or objects to surgery when it's done for ostensibly justified purposes. So, at any rate, this was really the nadir of psychiatry. And the question is how did it reach this point? It did some bad things. It looked foolish. And it really was able to be presented through the media to society in a way that was completely unflattering and disparaging. And there were two main reasons why. In the history of medicine, which really began at the end of the 18th century, you know, all medicine was basically physicians and surgeons. And then it was at that time scientific methods began to be applied, different specialties began to be developed, and psychiatry and neurology were combined in one of the first ones. And over the 19th century and then the 20th century, progress was made, microorganisms, understanding physiology, medications, sterile technique, surgery, better obstetrical methods, anesthesia. But when it came to psychiatry and mental illness, bupkis. We couldn't find the cause of the illness, and we couldn't develop any effective treatments. Now, what changed that, I'm going to tell you in a moment, and it really didn't begin until the 1950s and really come to fruition and generate momentum at about the time that I was training in psychiatry, 1970s. But it's kind of exemplified by two people who were probably among the most famous psychiatrists in history, Sigmund Freud and Erich Kandel, both of whom came from Vienna. In fact, much of psychiatry, in terms of the scientific efforts to advance the field, have emanated from the German-speaking countries of Europe, Austria, Germany, and to a lesser extent Switzerland. Now, Freud undoubtedly was the most famous and important psychiatrist in history. Everybody knows his name. His terms have found their way into our popular nomenclature and vernacular. And he's viewed in a curious way of admiration, but also of kind of ridicule. And Freud is somebody who I would say is really a undeniably brilliant figure who contributed to society in a way that's probably comparable to that of Einstein. Because of the fact that in an intellectual vacuum, with no scientific understanding of how the brain worked and how the mind functioned as a construct of the brain and how it underlie behavior and mental illness, he invented a theory. And his theory was seminal, and it provided the first understanding for humans to understand how the mind worked and how you became the person that you are, psychologically speaking. Before that, there was no idea of an unconscious, that some stuff went on out of your awareness. The way an individual develops psychologically over their life cycle was not. Infants were thought to be tabula rasa, and adults just came to be. The idea of defense mechanisms wasn't known. The idea of components of the mind weren't known. Freud invented this. And the problem is that Freud was a novelist. He wasn't really a scientist. He invented something that was a great read and was really prescient. But he committed two mistakes. One, he was a control freak, and he allowed nobody to subject his theory to scientific experimentation to prove it or not. And the second thing, and this was more his disciples than Freud, is that Freud only described his theory and began to apply it with people who I would call the worried well. People like us who have maybe foibles and challenges in living and maybe some neurotic idiosyncrasies. But his disciples extended it to schizophrenia, manic depressive illness, depression, dementia, autism, and that begat the blame the parents strategy. So schizophrenia was caused by schizophrenic mothers. Autism was caused by refrigerator mothers. The mothers always get the brunt of it, don't they? Homosexuality. That was due to over-involved, controlling mothers and weak, effete fathers. So this was just terrible. No evidence to support it, and accusations of individuals as causal agents without any evidence to support that. Now, Erich Kandel was born in Vienna. Being Jewish, his family fled, came to the United States, grew up in Brooklyn, and he went to Harvard. And at Harvard, he dated a girl named Marianne Criss. And Marianne Criss's parents were both two Austrian emigres who were psychoanalysts, having been trained by Freud. And when she introduced Kandel to her father, he said, well, what are you studying? So I'm studying history. He says, why do you want to study history? He says, because I had to leave all my friends and our neighbors who I thought we really loved us and we had a good relation. They turned on us like animals. I want to understand how human beings can do this. Because, well, if you want to understand human nature, you need to study psychiatry. So he decided he was going to become a pre-med major and go to medical school. And he did. And he was going to be an analyst. So he went to medical school, and after medical school, he then went to train and was like everyone at the time, learning psychoanalysis. But he thought, if I'm going to be studying about the mind and curing the ills of it, maybe I need to know something about the brain. Now, it seems to be an obvious thought, but frankly, that wasn't being done in any systematic way within academic departments of psychiatry. And so he decided one summer to go work in a lab that was doing neuroscience. And that led him down a path to study the brain in a way that would shed light on human behavior and mental illness. Now, when he went to see his mentor in this laboratory, he says, I'd like to find out where in the brain the id and the ego lies. And the guy laughed at him. He says, you must be joking. He says, if you want to understand how the brain works, you're going to have to study it one neuron at a time. So from there, he went to the NIH, and then he came back to Columbia, and in the year 2000, he receives a Nobel Prize for having discovered the molecular and cellular basis for memory. Why memory? Because in Freudian analytic theory, repressed memories are the key to underlying conflicts. But he obviously pursued it, and it took him into a much more fine-grained and informative line of work. And it really reflects the dichotomy that psychiatry has oscillated between over its history, the psychodynamic and the neurobiologic. And the result has been, at this point in time, is something which in the book I call pluralistic, which means that psychiatry studies human behavior and how mental illness derives from that. And it's not an either-or, whether it's in the molecules, in the cells, and the chemicals, or it's in the traumas, the memories, and the conflicts. It's both. And the reason that it's both is because the brain is really unique, more than any other organ. If you think about it, your heart is basically a muscle with chambers. It's a pump. Your kidneys are filters. Your lungs are bellows. Your GI system is a porous tube. The brain, though, is comprised of over 100 billion neurons, 30 trillion connections, performs myriad functions simultaneously. While I'm talking to you and thinking about what I'm going to say, how you're reacting, what the weather's like in New York, and whether our plane's going to be delayed. If my wife thinks I'm talking too long and I should cut it off. My son says, I've heard this 100 times before, and he's not telling any jokes. My mother's kvelling. It's also controlling my body temperature, determining if I'm adequately hydrated, regulating the movement of my gestures. It's an extraordinary organ. It's, totally exponentially more complicated and unique than anything else in the universe. It's also unique in another way. The brain's the only organ in the body that doesn't feel pain. So if you have a heart attack, you feel crushing chest pain. If you have an ulcer, you feel pain. If you have a toxin poisoning your liver, you feel. If you jab a knife through the brain, except for your scalp and your skull, you will not feel anything. It's also unique, though, in another way, is that for any organ in the body to get sick, it's got to be exposed to an insult, either trauma, an infection agent, a poison, some metabolic disturbance, blunt trauma, circulatory deficiency. In the brain, you can experience problems because of those things also, but you can also experience it just from experience. Nothing touching you. The best example of that is PTSD. So PTSD is something that's been kind of misunderstood and maligned, but I don't think anybody denies its existence, that it does happen. And what is it? It's somebody who's ostensibly normal and asymptomatic, unimpaired, has either a massive traumatic experience or series of traumatic experiences and produces a neurobiologic change which results in an enduring set of symptoms. So the ethereal can produce a biological change, and that's unique to the brain. So I'm going to sort of move ahead. by trying to bring this to sort of a conclusion and say that whereas for the first 150 years of its existence, psychiatry was basically spinning its wheels and getting a very bad reputation, all of a sudden, beginning in the 1950s, things turned around kind of serendipitously. Psychotropic drugs were developed by accident, which turned out to be life-changing. Science began to dictate how treatments or theories were evaluated and whether they were credible and viable to be used. Technology introduced non-invasive imaging methods, MRIs, PET scanning. Genetics moved from epidemiologic genetics to molecular genetics, and the whole field of neuroscience burgeoned to the point that it's now a huge field with tremendous momentum. The difference that's occurred as a result of this has been, for the people who have benefited from it, transformative, and the difference between life and disability or death. So Mike Wallace and Jane Pauley, both of whom I've known, after General Westmoreland sued Wallace and CBS, he became morbidly depressed and suicidal and was saved with ECT and antidepressants. Jane Pauley had a lifelong problem with mood disorder, but became floridly manic after taking steroids for an allergy, and now is on lithium. Imagine if Hemingway might have been saved from suicide. Virginia Woolf, who had virulent bipolar disorder, would have been able to receive treatment. We all know the story about Howard Hughes, who had severe OCD. John Nash, who tragically died. He won a Nobel Prize for the work he did before he developed schizophrenia. Imagine if he hadn't, or there would have been treatment for him. And here's two examples of individuals. Ellen Sachs has a very severe schizophrenia, but she has an endowed professorship and runs an institute at the law school. She graduated from Yale Law School, was a Rhodes Scholar. Kay Jamison is a psychologist in the faculty at Johns Hopkins, has written books, The Unquiet Mind, about her struggle with a manic depressive illness and how lithium has been a lifesaver for her. So for these people, if this had happened 50 years before, there would have been nothing but maybe institutionalization or support from their families and disability. So things have changed from a scientific standpoint, from a clinical standpoint, even from a social and political standpoint. Joe Biden, who tragically has lost his son, but even before that has spoken out about mental illness with his earlier experience with losing his wife in an auto accident. Patrick Kennedy, who left Congress to become a spokesperson about mental illness. So things are changing. However, they're not changing fast enough. So the field still gets a bad rap, and as I say to it, psychiatry is like the Rodney Dangerfield of medicine. Doesn't get the respect. So I love this quote. Samuel Goldwyn, the film producer, anyone who goes to see a psychiatrist ought to have their head examined. The definition of psychiatry is the care of the id by the odd. Psychiatry enables us to correct our faults by confessing our parents' shortcomings. And there's nothing wrong with the average person that a good psychiatrist can't exaggerate. So basically what we're dealing with now is the persistence of old prejudices and attitudes. It's like fighting the last war when the war's already over, the last battle when the war's already over. And the stigma persists. We don't have adequate health care financing, even though the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act has helped. We don't have an adequate kind of workforce to provide this with everybody, which is why we have these repeated mass killings, most of which are perpetrated by individuals who are untreated with psychotic disorders. We have rates of addiction, domestic violence, homelessness occurring. And the fact is that this doesn't have to be. Whereas half a century ago, maybe we couldn't have really done much to stem these. We can now. But it's the attitudes, the government's inaction, the lack of the policy, infrastructure, and financing to enable it to be implemented. So we're moving in the right direction, and my message really is basically one of hope and change and possibility. But affecting that is the challenge. And so what I would end by is saying, what can you do? I think first, people have to get over the embarrassment or the reluctance or the timidity to sort of address these subjects. If you see somebody that you're concerned about, you should talk to them. You should encourage them to see someone for help, beginning maybe with their primary care doctor. Jared Loughner, when he shot Gabrielle Giffords and those people in Arizona, he sat in his community college for over a year acting weird, bizarre, menacing, and people ridiculed him or were afraid of him and avoided him or called the campus security. If he was choking, if he fainted, if he had a seizure, people would rush to his aid. They would call 911. They would take him to student health service. But nothing happened until he did what he did. So we have to get over that. The other thing is, to the extent that you're politically active, and I've already sort of got the best political activist I know to do something about it, Cindy, my sister. Talk to whoever is in a position of political responsibility about how healthcare is being financed, particularly how mental health care is being financed, about biomedical research. And if you have any connections with the media, I know their job is to get ratings and to sort of sell tickets and books, but they really sort of exploit this area at the the justification of artistic license, but in a way that is not necessarily very constructive. So the reality is that nobody should need to suffer now, and the future will be much brighter for anybody who happens to have to endure the consequences of a mental disorder. But we need to, I think, move faster in terms of enabling the rate of progress. So I would thank you for your attention, and if Dan will permit me, I'll be happy to answer some questions also.
Well done, Jeff. Today at the City Club, we're enjoying a special forum featuring Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman, author of Shrinks, The Untold History of Psychiatry. We encourage you to organize your questions for Dr. Lieberman now and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point and hopefully questions. Be sure to tune into our Friday forums via our primary media partner, 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV, that's all Idea Stream, or one of the many other radio stations across the country and across the region that carry City Club programs. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Be sure to join us on Friday, June 12th, as we welcome Tom Zenti, CEO of University Hospitals, for a conversation on the future of healthcare in Northeast Ohio. For information about any of our upcoming forums or any of our past forums, please visit us online at cityclub.org. Today we welcome guests at tables hosted by the Case Western Reserve University Department of Psychiatry, City Club member Cindy Dempsey, the Harbor Light Complex, Recovery Resources, and the Margaret Clark Morgan Foundation. We thank you all for your support. We'd also like to thank our bookseller, A Cultural Exchange, for being here today to make copies of the book available. Now it's time to return to Dr. Lieberman for our traditional City Club Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding our microphone today is our Director of Programming, Stephanie Jansky. Do we have our first question?
Hello, Dr. Lieberman. Thank you so much for coming. It was a fascinating talk. And knowing your strong mother and sister, I can see that you turned out just great.
I just did what they told me to do.
Okay. But my question does relate to that. Because I'm wondering if you can shed a little more light on the facts that led the people in medicine a long time ago to conclude that women were the source of the problem, or that mothers were the source of the problem. I would assume that those coming to those conclusions were basically men. And I'm wondering whether it was just a blatant sexism, or was there something to it?
I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, now the ratio of the gender distribution in medical student classes is 50-50, or if there's, oftentimes it's more female than male. In our residency, it's the same thing. But then it was predominantly male. But I think the tendency to attribute to women, mothers, more than men as causes of these things, probably just is reflecting the misogynistic tendencies of society as a whole. There was nothing particular to psychiatry. I think it was just that it lent itself to that kind of bias to be reflected in it. And the whole idea of hysteria, hysteria referring to the uterus, there's a whole theme that's embedded in all aspects of our society, including medicine, but more in psychiatry than other fields of medicine, that reflects that. And just like Louis Brandeis said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Research is the best disinfectant when it comes to prejudicial theories. It's interesting because the thing which is, I think, revolutionizing all of healthcare now is genetics, and particularly what's called personalized or precision medicine. The best example is cancer. I mean, cancer we used to diagnose by anatomy and histology. Is it in the ovary? Is it in the lung? Is it in the prostate? And then look at it under the microscope and see what the particular cellular formation was. Now it's diagnosed by its genetic signature. So it's peeling the diagnostic onion. I think we will see that, and we are already beginning to see it in psychiatry, but my point is that the origin of psychiatric genetics, does anybody know what the origin of psychiatric genetics is? Fred, you probably know this. You can't answer. Molly?
Tell us, Professor.
It's Sir Francis Galton in the 19th century who invented eugenics. I told her not to answer, so get someone else to. But the idea was that there was degeneration in in genes over generations that led to mental illness, and let's eliminate them. So it was an ignominious beginning. So there are a lot of things which have turned out to be scientifically hugely informative and valuable had these kind of ignominious beginnings till we get the stuff out, and it's only done through research.
Jeffrey, thank you for a fantastic talk and for a fantastic book. They're both fantastic, and for responding to my email telling you it was fantastic. Yeah. You characterize psychiatry as 150 years of fiddling, and then beginning in 1950, things began to improve. But the anti-psychiatry movement, one of the effects of that, of course, was deinstitutionalization. And we have now taken 95% of those of us who would have been in those hospitals and are now out. However, as our media friends are waving a flag over now, one result is that we have 10 times as many seriously mentally ill people in jails and prisons as we have in psychiatric hospitals. Could you comment on your degree of concern about this and make any recommendations as to how we might go about addressing this?
Well, the deinstitutionalization movement really was a good idea, but badly implemented. The concept was really to, instead of cloistering people in these institutions, to treat them in the community. And politicians thought this could be done given the advent of psychotropic drugs and the emergence of some psychosocial support mechanisms, which we now call things like case management, supported employment, social and vocational rehabilitation, cognitive remediation. The problem is these things weren't provided, so basically it didn't turn out well. The more cynical people will say, well, the politicians just saw this as a way of defunding the mental health systems and saving money to use for other things without putting the money back into the mental health system for community-based services. But regardless, it didn't work out too well, and you're absolutely right. The individuals who in decades past would have been in mental hospitals now comprise the 30 or 40% of the homeless who are mentally ill, or the growing percentage of people in prison who have mental illnesses. So we've laundered them through these different areas. The bad news is that it's shameful. I mean, it's as shameful as the snake pits that existed. The good news is that these are actionable problems that we could take care of. We don't need a scientific breakthrough to discover the cause or to develop a treatment for Huntington's disease or ALS. We don't have that in our power, but we do have in our power to correct this. The problem is we're just not doing it, and it's simply the lack of social and political will. So hence my admonition to become more politically engaged, which you already have been, but everyone else.
Hi, I also want to thank you for coming. I'm Wheezy Scott, and I am a member of the Cindy Dempsey fan club. There are a lot of us here today. My question has to do with the over-medication prescription, and how do you feel about internists prescribing psych drugs when it seems to me it should be psychiatrists who are doing that?
Yes and no. I think the issue about overprescribing is one that psychiatry usually gets targeted about, but it's not limited to, antibiotics are overprescribed, prescription pain medications overprescribed, arthroscopic surgery for degenerative arthritis is overprescribed. A lot of things are, but antidepressants, antipsychotics, psychostimulants, those are the things that more regularly get criticized. In terms of internists, I think, you're right. The antidepressants, which are really probably the most commonly prescribed psychotropic drug, the majority of them are prescribed by non-psychiatric physicians. And I think the question is if you have a primary care doctor, whether he's an internist, a family practice doctor, a pediatrician, should they prescribe them? Sure. If they can make a diagnosis and if they know, what drugs to use, what dose to administer, the various side effects to monitor for, they should be. Because, frankly, there's not enough psychiatrists or there's not enough mental health professionals. People don't necessarily have ready access to it, and you do have a relationship. So why not? But you're absolutely right. And they tend to use the wrong medication a lot, or they tend to dose it inadequately, and they may be prescribing it when it doesn't need to be. So that's a training thing. But what I tell or I respond to when critics say, what about the overprescription? When the book came out, the first program I did was CBS Morning News, and Charlie Rose is always a very fair, very intelligent interviewer, but he had a young guy, I forget the guy's name, who was sort of subbing that day, who was ready to jump in. Well, what about all the 250,000 antidepressants that were prescribed to people that don't need them? And I said, well, there may be some overprescription to people who are just blue because, they had an argument or, lost their job or something, but may not have real major depression and need it. But the reality is that there's more people who genuinely need psychotropic medications, antidepressants or otherwise, for illnesses they suffer from who aren't getting them than there are people who don't need them who are getting them. And that's the real concern. So I think we have to have a policy in the country of how we're going to provide health care to the population, including mental health care. And in that context, roles need to be better defined, and training needs to really support the functions of these different roles.
Can you just talk a little bit about what you see as potential consequences or the impact of legalization of marijuana?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I never inhaled. That's the first thing I want people to know. You know, it's a complicated issue in the sense that on one hand, people will say, well, listen, why can't we have a recreational intoxicant like pot, which is certainly no more dangerous than alcohol is or tobacco is? And on the other hand, the problem is we don't know what all the consequences will be. So the biggest concern is really youth. And the concern there is that, okay, we can say we know what marijuana will do to the adult brain in terms of any long-term effects, any effects on behavior, any possible untoward psychiatric consequences, but we don't know what it's like for young people who are maybe start smoking while their brain is still maturing. And you say, well, wait a minute. In Colorado or wherever else they've legalized it, you can't buy it until you're 21, right? But we know that that doesn't work. You know, kids younger get cigarettes, they get alcohol, so they're going to get marijuana too. And the marijuana they'll get is going to be very potent because it's going to be manufactured in a way to maximize the effect. And so what we're doing is we're running a grand social experiment. So as a result of this, Nora Volkow, who's the director of NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, managed to get Congress to allocate funding to do a longitudinal study of I don't know what the N is, something like 30,000 kids who are turning like 10, and study them for the next decade to see what happens, knowing that some number of them are going to be indulging in marijuana. So we'll find out in 10 years. I personally am not opposed to it, but at the same time, I think we're taking a little bit of a risk not knowing what the consequences are.
My name's Richard Dempsey. I'm also a member of the Cindy Dempsey fan club. I know this question could be, you could spend hours talking about this. You've done a great deal of research in this area of medicine, and you've talked about the brain, this mysterious and this incredible organ in the body that responds to medication. Just generally speaking, how does the brain actually respond to the medications? And I know there are many different ones as people in the mental health profession make the diagnoses. Second, do you find that people need to stay on these medications for the duration of their lives? And then you have the issue of making sure they continue to take them. And I know this is a very broad question, but the Gabriel Gifford shooter guy, somebody sends him to the mental health clinic, he gets on the medication. How do you ensure that he stays on it? And really, how does it work on the brain? And lastly, did you go into psychiatry also because of mental cruelty as an Ohio guy imposed on you by Coach Bo Schembechler? I'd like to know that as well.
My brother-in-law, Richard, the lawyer, is referring to the fact that I played football at an earlier, less enlightened stage of my life, and that I had a football coach who was known for his emotional dysregulation. I would say it's probably less due to Bo's volatility than it is to the chronic encephalopathy that I may have, traumatic encephalopathy I may have incurred. But in terms of your questions, so how do psychotropic drugs work in the brain? Well, basically the idea is let's take depression or psychosis. The way human physiology works is on equilibria. You know, you have to maintain an equilibrium or homeostasis within certain boundaries, you know, in terms of your chemistry and your physiology, and we all experience extremes in these. When we exercise, our heart rate goes up, our temperature goes up, we sweat, we become more dehydrated. When we're under stress, our brains work a lot more, or when we're concentrating on something, take an exam, and so you exercise and then you kind of recuperate. That's why we sleep also. So there's a process of the body being able to adjust to these sort of extremes that are imposed upon us by the environment or through effort, But sometimes the regulatory capacity to maintain this equilibrium or maintain boundaries breaks down. And as a result of that, symptoms can develop and persist. So you can't maintain glucose homeostasis unless your pancreas is secreting enough insulin, or unless the receptors that respond to insulin are appropriately sensitive. In the brain, you have a capacity for emotion regulation. You go through an emotional roller coaster with a family member who gets sick, and you're not going to know if they're going to recover. But then the doctor comes out and gives you the good news, and you're relieved. But if it goes bad, then you're distraught, and then you have to grieve and get over. But the way that the body has been developed over time, it's capable of enduring these things. But in cases, some individuals, they don't have the capacity, and their emotional regulatory system gets exceeded, and they became persistently despondent or overexcited. In the case of psychosis, there's a similar type of excess that occurs in perception of stimuli and in the analysis of the information that you're perceiving in the world. And you put this together in distorted ways and begin to have strange ideas or even hallucinate stimuli. So what psychotropic drugs do is basically to give you a kind of an assistance in reestablishing this equilibrium. And it does it for the various disorders in various ways.
And we're about out.
Oh, we're out?
We're almost.
Okay.
I mean, I'll give you 30 seconds.
And what was the other question?
Well, do people have to stay on it for
Oh, yeah. So do people have to stay on insulin for diabetes? Do people have to stay on antihypertensive medication for hypertension? In some cases, yes, but not in every case. And you're right about the fact that for psychiatric disorders, more than maybe for other disorders, the idea of accepting the fact you have an illness and agreeing to continue to take medication is more of a challenge, because it seems to, it's like a narcissistic injury to think that there's something wrong with our brains and minds. Great questions, great discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That was wonderful. Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a forum featuring Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman. He's the author of Shrinks, The Untold History of Psychiatry, and he happens to be a shrink himself. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being a part of this today. Dr. Lieberman, thank you. This forum is now adjourned.